Hello, this is Chris Ott, and this is number 11 in this series on metaphysics. And probably this should be called on logic, but I'm including it here because it's very pertinent. They relate. Metaphysics is the study of what's really real, but and epistemology is the study of which includes logic, which is the study of how do we know that our conclusions are true. And so anyway, I want to talk about this. And all this is in my second book. And it might not at first seem all that pertinent to the metaphysics of the evolution of perception, but I really wanted to be thorough, and I felt that when I studied philosophy, I didn't think that contemporary philosophers were that thorough. Not all of them. They didn't bother to look at how they know what they claim. There's a lot of just assuming. And I was amazed that that was so sloppy in that sense. And I wanted to talk about some of these things. I remember, all logic, a lot of logic can be reduced down to certain basic logical principles like modus ponens. And I remember asking Chris Hill, who's a famous philosopher, who was one of my teachers, with the class asked, I was just quiet. The class asked, well, how do we know modus ponens since we can't logically deduce it? So how do we know it's true? And he was so disturbed by it, he ran out of the room with everybody chasing him. He ran down the stairs just to get away from everybody because he didn't have an answer. So we just go by, it's axiomatic. We just go by some assumptions. For myself, I like to know, well, how do we know these things? And do we really know them? Anyway, I tried to answer those in my second book because I was dealing with something pretty radical, and so a new idea, a large new idea, so sort of global idea, this new cosmology. So I felt like it was incumbent upon me to talk about. I mean, how can we base our claims? In my first book, The Evolution of Perception, that was much shorter, it was only an 81-page book, and I wrote it in 2004, and I based it simply on simplicity, and then I gave an argument that's for why a simpler conclusion is more likely, but it doesn't prove that the conclusion is true. It only proves that it's if it has less assumptions, then it's more probable. But that's not the same as proof. But it's as close as I could get then. Later, I realized that there were ways that we can establish things, but I want to talk about them because even these points are kind of radical. So I'm amazed how often, I'll start this out by saying this, I'm amazed how often in reading somebody who's not a philosopher, but is trying to be thorough and philosophical and be responsible epistemologically. They say, I deal in facts and logic. And other people, they don't seem to deal with facts and logic. And this is a little like the claim that I've got common sense and nobody else appears to have it. So apparently this common sense isn't very common. But anyway, that's another subject. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about logic. So these people say, well, I deal with facts and logic. Usually when people talk like that, they really haven't looked very deeply at how we know something is a fact or what logic is. And I'm going to talk about both of those. So first I'm going to talk about facts and how we attain them, how we don't attain them and think we do. And then we'll get to logic and how it works. And then we're going to see what we can learn from logic and what we haven't. And I probably talked about these things at various times over the years in different series of discussions. But I thought, sitting there this morning, I was going over what else can I talk about. And I decided I'd group these subjects together this way. So anyway, let's talk about, I deal with the facts. So the first thing about the facts is, how do you know Your premises are the things that you think are true. How do you know they're true? How do you know they're true? Well, one of the first answers that people give is observation. But observation actually has all kinds of limitations. Observation is prone to interpretation. Observation is also our experience is filtered through not just our brain, but our psychology. And so it's all an interpretation, what we observe. But let's just say that's probably the strongest evidence we can have for what we claim are facts. Like if I say it's a fact that Johnny stole the pencil sharpener. Well, if I saw him do it, well, that's pretty good evidence. So let's just say that's one of the strongest, even though imperfect, reasons to believe something. However, if you really think about it, 99% of what we claim to believe, or know even, we did not observe. Instead, we have it on testimony. So we are relying upon the observation of someone else, or others, or generations of people, but not ourselves. And I'll give some examples. And by the way, testimony includes all kinds of things. A map is testimony. There's a whole series of, cartographers had to, chart it out, and then it went through a process that it goes in a book. And then you read the book, you see the maps. That's testimony. So if I go, this city is to the right of this city, that's the testimony of the cartographers. And books are a form of testimony, and talks, and people lectures that we hear, and just testimony of but often the testimony that we rely on is actually an account of some observation. So I might describe what some sea voyager saw, but he saw it. Okay, so it still comes down to observation, but it's secondhand. All right, but better than hearsay, let's say, because we have reason to feel that this is an honest account of that testimony. Now, let me give an example to make this solidly clear. Almost anybody that you asked, if you said, well, is there a place called England? They would say yes. And then you said, well, is England an island? And then if they know anything about geography, they'll say, yes, England is an island. But how could you ever observe that England is an island? See, if you're in England and you walk and walk, you're not going to see that it's an island. And even if you walked the whole shore, which is virtually impossible, all the way around England, you came back to the same place, unless you were doing very careful notations based on a compass, you could have walked around the perimeter of a lake and not walked around the perimeter of an island, because at any one time you're just seeing that shore. I mean, just because you've come back to the same spot that you started, maybe weeks or months later, doesn't prove that it's by itself that it's an island. As I said, it could also be a lake. Now, if you go up in an airplane, you would think that you could look down from an airplane and see that it's an island, but you can't. An airplane doesn't go high enough to see that England is an island. So nobody who's gone up in a jet has ever observed by looking out the window that England is an island. They might just be, a part of the mainland, the continent, for all they can observe. So we use the example I was talking about, cartographers. In the past, sailors did sail around England, and they did keep good nautical, records, and they put it together, and the cartographers worked out the whole shore all the way around, and then it was seen through logic and many observations that it's an island. And then when you get out the map, that's the testimony of all that research and all that work. So that's how we know that England is an island. So we don't know it from our own observation. And we know it from testimony, like everything else. So let's say I know a lot about the world, and I could say a little about this country and this country and this country and this country and all kinds of things. I've never been to any of them. So essentially all that is testimony. And even in the United States, even if you've been in every state in the United States, you've been in a tiny, tiny fraction of the United States, and you've seen very little of it. So it's always going to come down to testimony. And I find that interesting. Now, very often, testimony doesn't agree, especially when facts are new. One person will say that they did, the study and the observations and the logic, and they'll give one answer, and somebody else will give another. So what do we do in those cases? And that's very frequent. It happens all the time in science. So happens in history. Obviously, there are different theories of what happened at certain points based on different pieces of testimony, and also using some logic and thought reasoning. So you have different accounts of the same facts. So how do we choose, if it's mostly testimony that we're relying on, how do we choose whose testimony to believe? Well, that becomes a hard problem the more you think about it, because usually, in my experience, I trust the testimony of the person who I just tend to trust. But why do I trust them? I kind of like them. I've seen other things that they've said that seemed true to me, and I've grown accustomed to trusting them. Sometimes they're just like, a member of my political party or something like that. And so it becomes kind of political, who I believe. And very often, it's not so simple how we choose who to trust. And to just say, I have the facts, is leaving out the fact that most of what you think are facts are testimony, and your reason for choosing whose testimony to use when there was any question between different accounts, that's pretty vague. You can't really prove that that this one is always right. Most people aren't always right. Most of us make mistakes. So that becomes an issue. When I've talked about what Mayor Baba says sometimes in my writing, that's a big problem there. How do we know he's right? He might be wrong. Well, I agree he might be wrong, but and he might be a complete fraud. But everybody can be a big fraud. I got to start somewhere. So I kind of start by assuming good faith and giving a reasonable doubt. I take some things as an initial starting point to then see how that works, and then go and examine if that actually can account for things better than other things. And then it stops even mattering whether the person was a fraud or not. If somebody can have poor character and even be a liar, but to use that as an argument against something that they've said is actually called ad hominem circumstantial. You're actually attacking the arguer, not the argument. See, some of the greatest ideas have come from people who are insane, who are dishonest, or were just very eccentric. For instance, I've often mentioned the writing of George Berkeley. Much of it, I think, is very good reasoning. However, people who want to disparage other people's liking Berkeley because they don't like his immaterialism, they'll sometimes mention that Berkeley wrote a book, his most popular book, about the positive effects of something called tar water, which was a beverage that he discovered when he traveled to America from Ireland. When he went back to Ireland, he wrote this book on tar water. And later, in modern times, they think a lot of the effects that he attributed to tar water, which were all hearsay and sort of, wives' tales and stuff, that they've been all discounted. And so you could say, well, he was a real crackpot, George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher in the early 1700s, and you could base that on his book about tar water. However, that's not actually, that's a fallacy. It's called ad hominem circumstantial. I mean, somebody could be steal hubcaps on the weekend, but be very good at logical theorems. You see, they're not the same thing. You know, his hubcap work doesn't cross over into his logical theorems. And that's the way it is. So even if I find fault with Meher Baba, or even if I decide he's a fraud, I'm very interested in the cosmology he laid out, because he could be a fraud and be a genius. See, and I wouldn't be the first person to have speculated about that, about Meher Baba. There was a guy named Paul Brunton in the 1930s who met Meher Baba, and he later wrote that he thought Meher Baba was a fraud, but he said, but he's a genius in religion. So it's interesting. A little off the point, though. So let's get back to our facts. So that pretty much covers that. We can observe things ourselves. There are some mitigating factors even in our own observations. There's a movie called Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa, a Japanese director from the 1950s, I believe, or 40s. And it's and in the film there's a rape, and then all the witnesses are interviewed, and they all give a different account of the story. So that was to point out that even being an eyewitness is imperfect, because there's so many factors that can influence your interpretation of what you saw. Okay, so anyway, without going into all those, let's go on now to logic. Because I said there are a lot of people, and they go, well, I stick with with facts and logic. You know, other people, I don't know what they're doing. But me, I'm a real, keen player. So next is about logic. People who brag about their use of logic, and that's why they tend to be right about things, don't understand what logic is. And a lot of philosophers don't understand what logic is. And I'm going to talk about what logic is. And it's not that complicated. I think I can cover it here. There are mainly two forms of logic. One is called induction and one is called deduction. There's a third kind that's talked about more in modern literature called retroduction. But I'm not going to talk about it because different books have different take on it. So let's stick with the classical, the induction and deduction. We've had those for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, induction and deduction, fancy words for very simple things. And they're not even understood by a lot of philosophers. Let's start with induction. Induction is where usually you start with an observation or series of observations, and then you make a general statement from them, like, every day this guy comes by and he's selling pencils outside, knocks on your door of your office, and he's going down the hall, all the little offices, trying to sell pencils. So today, I'm going to assume that this guy's going to show up selling pencils. That's induction. Now, philosophers sometimes say induction is moving from specific examples to a general principle. So lots of examples of him selling pencils, and I've come to the general view that he sells pencils all the time. And from that, I get that he's going to come by and sell pencils. But that's not true. There are examples of induction where that's not the case. This is what induction really is. We're born with an intuition. It's innate. It's inborn. You have to have it to learn as a human being. And even animals have this. And even plants can be shown to behave as if they're using induction. And what that is we're born with an intuition that there are patterns in the world, with an expectation to find patterns. We don't see a bunch of patterns and then get the idea that there's patterns in the world. because you wouldn't even be able to recognize the patterns if that were the case. You're born with an expectation of patterns, with an idea of what a pattern is, and you're looking for them, and then that's why you find them. And through patterns, you learn. For instance, that's how you learn to speak, is over and over. Your mother holds up this, and she calls it, a composition book. And after a while, you get it. You put those together. And that actually requires another intuition that I've talked about before, the intuition of reference and meaning. But it's still using induction to learn how to speak. And to learn anything, you need induction. So induction is the innate expectation for patterns. And when we say patterns, we expect patterns to continue in the future. If they've been a certain way in the past, we expect them to be that way in the future. Why do we expect them? Because that's what a pattern is by definition. So if I'm sitting at a table and we're revealing more and more of the pattern on the table, and it's all checkers, after I see so many checkers, I'm going to go, if we pull this all back, it's going to be all checkers. That's induction. I'm going, there's a pattern here, and going forward, the pattern will continue. The problem with induction is induction doesn't establish or prove anything, because I could rip off the tablecloth, and it only went halfway with these checkers, and then it was polka dots. Or the guy who I expect to show up with pencils, well, he might have been sick that day, or he might have died, got hit by a car. And even though I used induction to assume that he's going to show up with pencils, he doesn't show up ever again. So induction is kind of probabilistic. It's not even probabilistic. It's strong or weak. If you have if somebody's been showing up with pencils for 1,000 years, or that doesn't make sense, but a robot or something does, then it makes sense to say, well, I think it's going to continue for at least through the weekend. Because there's so much evidence inductively, but it still doesn't prove it. But still, it's a stronger case than if you've guys shown up 3 days in a row with pencils, and then you assume he's going to come this weekend. That's a weak case of using induction. But the important thing to get from this is less what induction is ultimately, which I say is an intuition about patterns, is that it can't tell you for sure if you're right. And there's lots of things you can't use induction on. For instance, with my cosmology or cosmologies, we can't go and look at how a whole bunch of universes form and then say, oh, well, now by induction, I will say the next, universes form this way, because nobody can sit and observe a universe form because it takes too long. So, it may have also evolved from states that you can't see. So it's just impossible to do it that way, induction. There are other things that it's been shown you cannot establish with induction. Okay, so let's move on from that. The point was, your facts that you have, they're questionable and iffy, and then induction isn't going to make you much closer to a conclusion. It's going to give you a strong possibility. And then the last thing we need to talk about is deduction. Deduction, like induction, is also based on an intuition. It's a very simple intuition. You're born with it. You need it to learn. You need it even to learn language again. You need this intuition. And this is the intuition that's called the rule of non-contradiction. Because a deductive argument simply assumes that if something contradicts, if there's a contradiction, then something's false in a statement. Okay, so so let me give an example. This is the classic example, but it continues all through much more complicated logic. But it's the simplest logical syllogism that's used to teach people what logic is. This goes, if all men are mortal, and if it's true that that Socrates was a man, then it's true that Socrates was mortal. It's true because to say otherwise, the conclusion would contradict the first two premises. So if I go, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, but Socrates is not mortal, well, then you just contradicted yourself, and so something's wrong there. And that we say is therefore you made a mistake. Something's wrong. But like induction, now notice, we can't learn anything about the world by deduction. We can just take our premises, usually based on, well, testimony of some observation, like Socrates was a man. I never met him, but let's say he was. And let's say I use the testimony that he was mortal because he did die. So Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. But I'm taking those facts, which are iffy and sketchy, but we got to use what we've got. And then as long as I'm consistent and don't do any contradictions, I remain logical and deductively. But I could never know anything about the world. For instance, I can't use logic to determine whether Socrates was a man. No. I can't use the logic to determine if Socrates was, whether all men are mortal. I can't even use induction to determine that, because induction you can't say all men, because induction is just sort of strong or weak. It's never absolute. So we have to, we can't learn anything. All we can learn about our beliefs using deduction is that our beliefs are consistent with each other, and we don't have contradictions. And that's a really good thing. That means that what you're saying is possible, but it doesn't mean it's true. Because you could you could have two complete systems about something, and they could both be internally logical and have no contradictions, but they contradict each other. They're different, but they both have no contradictions, and that's like a coherence theory of truth, and that these are internally coherent, internally consistent, but we have no proof that they're true, because that's not enough, because it's kind of like castles in the sky of the mind. We have a really great logical system, and that makes things very difficult to disprove or prove. For instance, let's say that the evolution of perception is internally consistent. So you can't disprove it, because to disprove it, you'd have to find a contradiction in it. But say you can't find a contradiction in it, it still doesn't prove it's true, for sure. Because there could be 2, 3, 4, 5 systems that people came up with that are all internally consistent, based on their own premises or the way they put things together. So I had to find yet a different way to make an argument that I know the evolution of perception must be true, and I did in the book. And it's you can read the book, you'll see what it is. It's necessary preconditions, which are it's really a form of deduction, but it's a deduction that does establish that the evolution of perception has to be true. See, and it's deductive because a necessary precondition is something that must come before some other event necessarily. And that's true by virtue of the words I just used. So therefore, a necessary precondition must necessarily, by definition, precede the conditions that it forms the conditions for. And that's how I did that. And it's a kind of, I've never heard anyone ever use that before. It's essentially going backward It's like, if these are the conditions and we can prove these are the conditions and there are necessary conditions and we can prove that by reasoning, then we know this had to have come before. And so we can actually move easier into the past than into the future using this form of reasoning. For instance, there are no necessary outcomes. Let's say I have all the conditions for making some new kind of spaghetti that nobody ever put together before. I have all the ingredients in the house, so I have all the conditions are there. But does that follow that definitely somebody's going to invent this new kind of form of spaghetti dish because the ingredients are in the house? No, it doesn't follow that. So this only works backward, which is really funny, because I would say that the only thing that we can prove logically is the origin of the universe, that it goes back to a single first condition. If nobody followed what I said, that's okay. I've never said it before. I don't think so. I don't remember saying it before, but I've thought it a lot. I'm going to add one more little thing because it's just a tidbit. I've already covered this. My point is that people who say they have facts and logic probably don't really know the problems with determining facts and separating them from opinions and controversial opinions that are in conflict by different testimonials. And so they're being kind of naive. I got the facts. The second is that I use logic. Well, all you can prove with logic is that your ideas are consistent, both with induction. It's consistent with the patterns you've seen before. The pattern is consistent, and the deduction is consistent, but that doesn't prove they're true. Well, then I hope I got that right. Okay, so, but now I want to say this other thing. There was this other thing that they kind of talked about on the side of epistemology in graduate school, and that is called skepticism. I'm actually not a skeptic. I can sound like one. I can talk about how hard it is to know something. But I'm not a skeptic. I believe we can know. And I believe we can know everything. But that's more kind of like a spiritual faith point. If I experienced enlightenment, I would be able to know everything and have deep access by definition because I'm enlightened. But and that assumes a whole lot of things, that there really are these lenses and that they could be removed and then I could see things as they really are, kind of a Blakean sense from the poem The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If you could see things as they are, we'd see them as infinite, that kind of thing. But okay, so this thing about skepticism is and this is old, it goes all the way back to Socrates. He even addressed this and he saw the problem of it in it. Usually skepticism is stated like this: we can't know anything. Okay, it's impossible. For all the reasons I've talked about, we can't really know anything. Well, the problem with that claim is that it's a claim that one is pretending to know. So therefore it's a self-contradiction, and therefore something's definitely wrong. Because the person who says we can't know anything is contradicting himself because he seems to know that he can't know anything. So what does he do? He wants to get rid of that. He doesn't want to contradict himself. So what does he do? And skeptics have thought about this for a long time. And it occurred to me that there is a solution to it. And it's very, very simple. And I call the one that I just stated, we can't know anything. I call that negative skepticism because it's a negative statement. It's saying what can't be. And that's always a problem because it's hard to prove a negative, isn't it? Because tomorrow I might suddenly find a way that I can know things, and that would disprove that. So it's very hard to prove a negative because the opposite could come, the affirmation of the opposite could come along any time. So, in contrast to that, I thought of something which I call positive skepticism. And let me state, it's very simple. All things are possible. Now, what do I mean by all things? I should qualify that. all things that are logically possible are possible. And what is logically possible? Those things where there's no contradiction. So if I make a statement and there's no self-contradiction in it, then it's possible. I mean, even if I said, really we're all made out of mud, as long as I didn't contradict myself, it's possible. Because how could that be? Maybe we're perceiving things wrong. We have no way to compare, as I said before, our experience with the way things are in themselves that produce that experience. So maybe we're really all made of mud. But then you'd have to have ideas about mud that are consistent with your experience of things. So that would be hard to make that case. But the point is, if there's no contradiction, a thing is possible. And when I say possible, I don't mean it's probable, because there's no way to draw. Probability has to be drawn inductively, like you throw coins, and then, how many coins are there, how many surfaces do they have, and you could do the math, and you could determine what the probability of getting a certain set of coin faces is on a certain number of coin tosses. But with this, we're not talking about that. We're just saying it's possible. So it can't be quantified. It's just is possible, which isn't a strong statement, because if all things are possible, then possibility is ubiquitous, and therefore it's trivial. So the claim that all things are possible is not you can't learn anything from it, because all things are possible. However, it does get rid of the skeptical problem, because you haven't made a claim that contradicts itself. The claim, we can't know anything, you've immediately contradicted it because you're making a knowledge claim. But when I say all things are possible, there's no contradiction, because it's perfectly possible that all things are possible. There's no contradiction there. Then a couple people have pointed out, they go, well, but wait a minute, I have a way to trick that up. If all things are possible, then it's impossible that there's something that's not possible. Well, that's really funny, because if you put that on paper, there's a thing called a double negative, a not, and it cancels out and it becomes a positive. So if I say, John is not married, all I've done is just said that John is married. So when you say that there is something that there's nothing that's possible that's not possible, you're just saying all things are possible. If you sort of do the reductions of the logic, and tested it over and over, and it's true. You try it yourself, and I have it in my notes. I have it in one of my books somewhere, and that's everything I've got on this topic of epistemology. And it's a matter of saying it well. Can I say these things well? Well, if I prepared and I had a script, but I don't. I just tried to wing it. But I hope that some of these things were interesting, and that concludes part 11, and we'll have part 12 soon. Take care. Bye-bye.